Looks like we've got about 150 people on the call here, which feels like a good place to start. The participants have slowed a little bit, so that might be a good starting point here. So I'll kick us off. Thank you guys. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're really excited to be here with you all, wherever you are in the world. I'm calling you from Chicago this evening. My name is Krista Robley. I'm the enrollment manager at the Institute of Design. We are happy to be partnering with Action Design Network tonight to bring you this great panel discussion on behavioral design, and are excited to hear from everyone on the call as well about your questions and your thoughts kind of throughout the evening too. Really quick, before we get going, we thought for those who might be new to the Institute of Design, to Action Design Network, perhaps both of us, we want to just provide you with a little bit of background information on who we are. So you just have a little bit of context for the conversation, and certainly if you're interested in hearing from us more or chatting with anyone from either group later on, we're certainly happy to do so. Tech check. Can you see the next slide? Just want to make sure. Great. So as I said, I'm the enrollment manager from ID. We say ID a lot. If you hear ID, we've got a couple faculty on the panel tonight. If they say ID, they're probably talking about our school. We are a graduate school, like I said, located in Chicago, really known for pioneering human-centered design and systems thinking. Our grads, our alum, our faculty, our partners are doing a lot of really interesting work. And we kind of started this series of events to feature the work that they do, as well as the broader design community. Certainly, our focus goes far beyond kind of just being a graduate school. We are an institute and do a lot of work kind of beyond the classroom. Like it says on the slide, we really are an international community of learners and practitioners, and use design to tackle some of the kind of meatiest, most challenging kind of problems, and opportunities that we're facing in this world. And so, tonight, like I said, you will hear from a few people who happen to be part of our community. But like I said, we're really excited to be partnering with Action Design Network as well. Leslie here is part of the Chicago chapter, and she has been a great help kind of putting this event together. And so I'm going to pass it over to Leslie to tell you a little bit more about Action Design Network.
Thanks, Krista. Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Presto. I'm one of the co-organizers for Action Design Chicago, specifically, alongside Cindy, Simone, and Mariah. A little bit about Action Design Network. At a higher level, we are a global nonprofit organization, really dedicated to uncovering behavioral science practices all around the globe to individual communities within cities. Our community has over 10,000 practitioners and researchers that are interested in exploring the use of behavioral economics and psychology in the design and development of services, products, and policies. And mostly the community is just looking to help people take action to improve their lives. We've hosted events ranging in topics around bias, wicked problems, behavioral interventions, AI, and so much more. If you're interested in learning more about Action Design, you can find us on our meetup group. But we also have a podcast called Action Design Radio, and you can find out more interesting behavioral science and economic conversations there. We are excited to partner with IIT ID to bring you the event we have tonight, which is on behavioral design. We're going to be talking about behavioral design and diving into collaboration and particular complexities that may come along with that. Our panelists for this evening has graced us with their presence, and we're super, super grateful to have them and learn and grow from them. Tonight we'll be talking with Eric Johnson, who is an applied behavioral science consultant and co-creator at productpsychology.com. We also have Rochelle Martino, who is a partner, industry advisor and teaching assistant at the Chicago Booth School of Business. And then we also have Ruth Schmidt, who's an associate professor at the IIT Institute of Design. Tonight we have Adam Kalish, who will be moderating the discussion tonight. Super grateful to have him on as well. And he is a principal at Trope Collaborative and also an instructor at IIT's Institute of Design. So Adam will be leading the panel discussions and diving into individual questions later on at the end of the evening. So if, just as a quick reminder, if you do have questions, please throw them into the Q&A section and we'll do our best to get to them. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Adam so we can get started.
Okay, thank you, Krista and Leslie. Welcome to the moderated portion of the event. I was looking at the chat feed and we have participants from Australia and India and Ireland and Switzerland and Guatemala and many other places, so thanks for attending. Thanks to those who submitted questions for the event. We reviewed your questions and clustered them into themes. We sent in advance 3 key questions to the panelists to have them quickly encapsulate the perspective for 5 minutes. And then we can build on that for the rest of the evening. As Leslie mentioned, Krista of ID and Leslie from the Action Network will be monitoring the chat feed, and we'll continue to gather questions and ask those during the question and answer session. The event is being recorded and will be shared with everyone after this event, along with all submitted questions and some behavioral design resources that were generously submitted by the panelists. So what I'd like to do is to start with Rochelle's response to the 3 questions that we sent, and then Eric, and then we can end up with Ruth's response. So I'll turn it over to Rochelle.
All right, thank you. So should I outline the questions before I dive into them, or did you already do that and I was blacked out?
No, however you'd like to do it. It could be
okay.
So it's just your time.
Great. Well, hi everyone. It's great to meet you, Rochelle Martino, as you've been already introduced to me, and it's great to be here with you today. Really appreciate all the attention and spending time on learning about this topic, which is obviously a passion of mine. So the first thing I want to get into is a response on how I would define behavioral design. Is that accurate enough? Am I recalling that correctly? What is behavioral design? So behavioral design to me is, actually I'm going to say what I think behavioral science is first, because I think of that as more of what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think of applied behavioral science as looking at the confluence of what we know about human psychology, economics, decision-making, neuroscience, just like a real holistic study of what ends up composing our decisions on a day-to-day basis, and then being able to kind of distill from that empirical truths that either help us understand when errors are being made or when we consistently are biased to act in one direction or another. But basically we have this like whole world of insights that we kind of know and therefore can predict or even cause different changes in behavior. And if we apply that across different business functions, or policy areas or lots of different contexts, we can try to drive change. And so that's what I think of as behavioral science. And as far as behavioral design, maybe I'll kind of modify what I just laid out and then say probably everything I said, plus more of a human-centered approach as well, which I think is, crazy vital. And especially from a starting point, I think probably you could argue that maybe the best outcomes are from this top-down approach of the empirical science, and maybe the bottom-up of really looking and empathizing first, perhaps makes a really great combination. So I'll just start with that. And next question was around what the value of behavioral design is and the frameworks that companies can use. And so I think I already gave a bit of an outline about exactly what the value of behavioral design or behavioral science is in general. And so just to talk about the frameworks and the different methods that could help companies, a particular approach that my company takes, and so I work for Behavioral Site, which is a small consultancy. We personally believe and kind of follow the thesis that a person's behavior is a function of, a person is a function of the behavior and the environment. Yes, and so why am I blanking on this? I'll get back to this. So essentially, what we're interested in is not necessarily to think that all people are consistent all the time, but rather to appreciate how noisy and how context dependent all of the decisions that we make day to day are. And so I think if you kind of come from that approach, rather than thinking this person is this way, this is their belief, this is their value system, how do I like convince them of something different? How do I change their beliefs? How do I draw their attention to something? Maybe instead of that, you realize the environment and the levers that you present, the options you put out there are just as important. Start with that. Worry less about changing this person fundamentally. How do you know that's what's causing what you see? Maybe it's just the first list on the, first option on that list. So that's another area. And then I really think that behavioral science would be excellently used in the space of patient adherence to therapies. And I think that the reason why I'd love to see more focus on this area is because it is a place where we really don't know enough. We really need a lot of help. This costs all of us a great deal. And a ton of different fields study this because it sits at this intersection of psychology, of just core medical research, of designers certainly, and there's all these different stakeholders that really care about improving it. Yet it's very hard for us to, and we haven't really been able to tackle it. So maybe we have been just taking a subpar approach, or we need to be more creative, but I'd love to focus in that area more. How did I do, Adam?
Did great, wonderful. I know more now than I did before you started, so that's great. So thank you very much. So I'd like to turn it over to
your knowledge.
Oh, is it my turn? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Yeah, it sure is, Eric.
Cool. Thank you. Well, thanks a ton for everybody for joining. This is really exciting. This will be fun. I'm amazed that people are up in the middle of the night in places like Ireland or the crack of dawn in India. So thanks a lot. We'll try to make it worth your time. So covering those same questions. So first question was, what is behavioral design? I think my answer is pretty similar to Rochelle's in that I thought of it in two ways. That I think when you kind of work in this field, I feel like behavioral science is the term that gets thrown around a lot. And I'll say this is kind of a surprisingly interesting question because I think we all work in this field and use these terms a lot, but don't really think about what they mean that explicitly. So it's kind of an interesting exercise to think through this. So behavioral science is kind of the term that's commonly used. And what behavioral science really is, if you're looking like the Wikipedia definition, is that it's basically a combination of different academic fields that are studying behavior and decision-making, why people are doing what they're doing. That ranges everywhere from anthropology to cognitive psychology and things like that. Behavioral science in a practical sense is a very broad term for anything working on driving behavior, decision-making, and things like that. I usually call myself like an applied behavioral scientist, where I take some of those insights from that and apply it to real world problems in business or the world or whatever that is. And I think that's kind of what behavioral design really is sort of the applied method of behavioral science. I thought of a very strict definition of this. The way I would define behavioral science in a real kind of strict sense: process of designing and optimizing an experience using insights and methods from behavioral science to motivate a specific behavior from an end user, basically. So the way I kind of think about it is, how do we take all this knowledge that we have from academic study of behavioral science and all these fields, then how do we use that to design experiences that drive people to a behavior? And I think we'll cover more what that means as we go further into this. And there's really a combination of a lot of things. I think UX design is a very important element to this. Behavioral science is sort of the underlying psychology of it. And the other really key element to that is like the scientific method, and that you need hypotheses, you have to test those hypotheses, you have to validate those, see what works. So that's kind of my general definition. Think about what the value is of that. So the value to me of kind of behavioral science in general and behavioral design, and what gets me excited about this is that to me, the world is not very well designed for how humans actually think and act. And a lot of our biggest problems are the result of this. A lot of our biggest individual problems and societal problems aren't really a lack of information or technology. It's difficulty following through on those things. Things like obesity, climate change, saving for retirement, all these things, like those are not problems of information or technology, really. It's a problem of behavior. And the problem is that like the world is just kind of working against us for all of those goals. Richard Thaler from University of Chicago, Nobel Prize winner, has a quote that I love where it says, "People aren't dumb, the world is hard." And I think behavioral science, like the value of taking behavioral design is that we can make the world a little bit easier for all these different things that people want to do to help them, from the mundane stuff that we can just make more enjoyable and easier, to the stuff that we really struggle to follow through on. We can actually help people and design experiences that help them get to that point if they want to get to. A practical sense in the frameworks and collaboration methods for companies, I think there's kind of three things that jump out from a good behavioral design process. One is efficiency. I think a good behavioral design process should kind of cut through the biases that prevent us from working on the right things in the right way. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go into it. Reduced risk is a big one. If you're applying that scientific method, you're developing hypotheses, you're testing them in a smart way, you're actually reducing your risk because you're kind of getting more at-bats and trying to find things that work to drive those behaviors. And finally, it's just impact. I really think that psychology and behavioral science is really a huge differentiator in the world. And I think a lot of companies and teams and policies and things like that, they really have an outsized impact, usually are kind of following that sort of kind of psychological advantage. Apple has never had the most technologically advanced phones or computers or anything like that, but they're the most successful company because people like using them and they're enjoyable to use, they're beautiful to look at, things like that. And then as far as like an example, I mean, there's tons of examples, but honestly, one that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which I think we're all thinking about, like a pandemic. There's a lot of debate of how to manage it at kind of every level, from cities to states to the federal level, all those things. And to me, I think a lot of the solutions would become a little more clear if we took that kind of human perspective and said, all right, how do we help people live as normal life as possible while this is around? I think in more problems that we thought from that framework, then it would become a little more obvious where we should focus our attention. So I will stop there and looking forward to covering this in more detail as we go.
Thank you very much, Eric. Ruth?
Sure. Well, and what's interesting is that what both Rochelle and Eric described, I was hoping that I may have things that were like very contrary, but for the most part, I think it's going to be building on what those folks have said. So when I think about behavioral design, completely agree that there's an element of applied behavioral science, which is totally part of it. The thing which is interesting for me working and living in a design school and thinking about behavioral design is that to a large degree, actually, and Eric, you used the term the scientific method, what's also kind of interesting is that behavioral science or behavioral design as it's often practiced is about the scientific method. And I think design and the design methodology that we can apply and use behavioral insights towards is sort of equally interesting, but maybe underutilized right now. Right now there's and for good reason, scientific method is great and it can help to prove things. It can also be a bit bounded because it's helping us to address questions and answer challenges which sort of work well in the scientific method. And sometimes what we're doing as behavioral designers or as designers is trying to think about how do we solve like what's sometimes called wicked problems? How are we trying to solve for things like sustainability? And I'm not saying that design or behavioral design is going to ever solve for all of those things all the time. But there are aspects of those problems that scientific methodology probably isn't as good at. And so when I think about behavioral design, I think I'm interested in combining the best of all those behavioral insights, which have been scientifically demonstrated, and a design sensibility that helps us to frame problems in a different way. And thinking about kind of what doesn't yet exist and how behavioral insights can help to achieve that. So that's kind of one part of it. The other thing, which I always tell students when we're talking about this too, is that the term behavioral design is even a little tricky, right? Because it sounds like we're designing behavior. And I think it's important for us all to think about and realize that we're not designing behavior, we're designing conditions that allow for certain types of behavior. So because sometimes when you think about like graphic design or product design, like we talk about designing that thing, humans do have agency. But what we can do is use what we know about behavioral science and behavioral design to design better stuff. So that's, I think, part of the goal there. In terms of the value, like both Eric and Rochelle touched on a bunch of things that I would agree with in terms of being able to take all these insights and put them into an applied setting. And that can be so useful for a whole variety of topics. So when I was in practice before coming to ID, for example, I was using it towards financial services to help people think about long-term planning, which we all know is super hard. It's enormously influential and useful in healthcare. Again, lots of trade-offs, lots of behaviors that are not necessarily good for us, but that we should do. So lots of issues there. But also things like education. I said sustainability before. I think the fact that behavioral design can attack, kind of like design does, so many different types of areas is a really interesting, valuable piece of it. So it's not limited to a certain specific kind of topic area. It's really, really widespread. And that sense of designing with behavioral insight to solve all sorts of problems, I think increasingly we're recognizing that it's not just behavioral change, it's kind of behavioral change within a system. And again, I think we might talk about some of these things later about the future, but thinking about how systems play a role too. So we're designing within systems that are constantly changing. That's a pretty complicated problem to solve for, but I think behavioral insights and behavioral science has some real interesting stuff to talk about. And then in terms of a specific kind of solution, talked about some domain areas. I think it's also really exciting to think about how behavioral insights can inform the development of things that don't exist. So less about changing behavior and more maybe about informing new offerings, whether that's new experiences, new systems. And a kind of interesting example of that some of you may be personally familiar with is like Lemonade, which is a rental insurance app. Dan Ariely is a pretty well-known behavioral scientist. He is, he's like, I don't know if it's actually his title, but he's the equivalent of chief behavioral officer. So he informed the creation of this product. And you can say like, oh, well, that's just an insurance product. But what they've done in an interesting way is bake in a lot of insights to reframe what insurance even is. Like none of us probably have really super great loving feelings about our insurance companies, but they've been able to kind of reframe what it is that that you do and how you get paid out and what the business model even is. So there are some interesting ways in which we can think about how behavioral insights can contribute to stuff that we don't even have or see. So less about correcting problems and more about thinking, creating and informing new stuff. So I will pause there too.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I think all three of you set some interesting foundations. There are similarities in terms of things that you talk about. It's not about design behavior. I think that's probably one of the big misconceptions probably that maybe people have who are new to it. But it's trying to figure out factors that influence behavior through the environment. I guess the first question I want to ask the three of you is, what is objectivity in the practice of behavioral science or design? You talked a lot about the scientific method, and how do you compensate for cognitive biases of the behavioral design researcher, the behavioral science researcher, and how do you ensure that you're designing with and not for people? That you're not just being outside of it, you're actually, working with people in this area.
Who should start?
Well, I just talked a lot, so I'll let one of you start.
I put, by the way, I put the question in the chat for the panelists, just so you have it in front of you. But yeah.
Take it away, Eric.
Sure. So this is definitely a really good question, and I think it's one that's probably not asked and discussed enough, I would say. I think sometimes this can be an area where behavioral scientists, behavioral designers can be a little unaware of their own biases. One thing I think if you work in this field, you realize is that just because you understand this stuff does not make you immune to it by any means. When think about that, so I know for myself, when I kind of developed my framework, a lot of what I focused on just like the way I kind of think about applying behavioral design when I was kind of starting to do this stuff. A lot of what I noticed as an issue when I was working with people was that it felt like they were just working on the wrong things. Like they would come to me with a question about some, so let's say I'm working with like a marketing team and they want to like optimize some specific subject line in an email. And I kind of look at it and the problem is like, they're just not like, no one's reading their emails at all. Or there's something fundamentally wrong with the strategy, right? So what I kind of found, it's a lot of times it's the whole strategy portion is just as important, because when we're thinking of what we should be working on and how to work on it, we're just as susceptible to biases as we are to any other portion, just as the people we're trying to help by developing a product or whatever that is. So you need an objective framework to work around those. And I think decision science is kind of the specific fields of the behavioral sciences, which is really good at this. But there's a number of strategies we should be thinking of to kind of counter those. There's a few heuristics. There's availability bias, like we default to whatever is the most top of mind and easiest to recall. There's like specificity bias. We just pick something, a number that sounds good, whether it's really grounded in theory or not, right? There's a lot of these things that affect how we do things. And that gets even more pronounced when we think about like aligning, like I said, designing with people and not for people. And what I think is especially difficult about that is that one of my favorite books on kind of behavioral sciences is called Elephant in the Brain. And the whole like concept of this book is that our brains are basically wired for self-deception, and that we're basically naturally convince ourselves of anything, and we'll actually believe it, even though, that's not what we really want to do, let's say. And I think this is especially a problem when you're behavioral design, in that it's very easy to say that, we need to sell this product. We need to get people clicking on this thing. And that's good for them because X. It's very easy to convince yourself of that story and not actually, ground that, because that's what the incentives are for you. And that's what's convenient for you. And that's what, makes you feel better about what you're doing. So, I could go into more detail, but I think a lot of it is you got to think about how do you design your process for building your strategy and your ideas with countering all these biases. So you have to think, here's my idea. What's the opposite of that idea? For example, like, this is a good thing. Why this is a good idea. Give me 5 reasons why it's a bad idea too. Like things like that you need to build in your process. And the other thing is, I think this should always stem from, I think sometimes people think behavioral science and stuff like user research or market research are sort of at odds. I would actually say they work together really well. And I think most of this stuff should stem from a really good understanding of that end user. You should have really good user researchers. You should be talking with users, customers, whoever you're serving all the time. You should have a really clear connection with that you're building off of, rather than just kind of guessing. And sometimes you kind of learn that as you're designing stuff and you're putting stuff in the world and seeing what they respond to as well. Yeah. If you're following a good strategy like that, then eventually users will tell you, because they will just stop doing it if you're not doing it well. So.
Rochelle or Ruth, if you want to jump in, because I think Eric bubbled up some very interesting things around this problem around objectivity.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Well, I agree with so much of what you
Rochelle,
said.
do you want to jump in and then I can follow up?
Sure. Well, do you want to talk next?
I'm sorry?
I was offering for Ruth to speak if she had something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sure. Actually, there were a couple of things. I could. Well, there were some of the things that Eric was talking about. Yeah, I can jump in. So completely agree with both what he was saying and some of the comments in the chat, that this need to think, it's not just about sort of, it's funny that, right, we're professional bias people, and yet people still fall for it, right? It's like, we can't get rid of the fact that we're biased. So like, throw that out the window. It's more important to recognize when it is occurring. The other thing that's interesting, and again, like coming from the design side of things, I'm not saying design has figured it out, but there actually is quite a bit of conversation in the design field about things like participatory design, or what's sometimes called co-creation, where you are like very literally designing with people. So rather than doing the research and then sort of saying like, thanks for the insights and we're going to go away and design, what participatory and co-creation can do is to actually invite people in. So you're baking in how people are behaving and thinking, and sort of all of those insights are not just on a piece of paper or recorded on video, but folks are very integral to the process. I actually don't know how much of that is happening in the field of behavioral design right now, although super randomly, just earlier this week, I saw somebody who posted some work that they were doing in New Zealand with indigenous populations that was doing exactly this. Like they had, you know, it's the cliche of like people at a table with sticky notes, but that's very much what they were doing. And that was really encouraging and interesting, I think, that it can be baked into the process of how one designs. And behavioral design can be, there is a learning curve. I think anyone who's familiar with this topic knows it's not like you read a Wikipedia article and now you know all these insights about behavioral design. So there's an interesting tension. How do we learn from lived experience, but also how do we build off of expertise that people develop like literally over years and with advanced degrees?
Absolutely.
So I think combining them is important.
Wonderful. Well, Rochelle, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, directly on to the end of what Ruth just said, that there is that tension between like, these are the things we know to be true, or we've observed in the environment, or academics have found in a lab, and then actually like that lived experience. So I think one great way of testing your own biases or realizing that you absolutely have them is to try to give yourself a dose of your own medicine. So I don't know, you know, if you have internal processes, you know, we consult on projects that involve looking at, you know, compensation or employee evaluation or hiring, and, you know, we're the experts, right? We know the biases. Well, I can tell you that we do eat our own dog food, and it hurts sometimes. And when it hurts and you think, well, gee, I don't want to do this, even if it's helping, that means that you're not quite there. And so I think that, you know, you can be your own feedback loop if you want to do that for yourself. That could be one idea. And then I think, and some idea that just percolated as Eric was talking, is that I do think that, you know, basically this type 3 problem, almost the type 3 error, like solving the problem that no one needed solving, is always a risk, I think. And that is easier to do, I think, as you have to, it's easier to do as it gets easier to measure your own research, I think. If you think about, like, you know, email subject lines, it's very easily codifiable to know if people are clicking on that. So it's pretty easy to actually study and look at incremental improvements in something like that measure. What could be more important is like a fundamental evaluation of the value prop of what that email is trying to get you to buy. It's a lot harder to test and control your way to what that should look like, because you can't, you know, it's like evolution. Like you would have to just like brute force every permutation if you were trying to do it experimentally, because you can change one thing at a time, look for a causal difference. So I think that it makes it extremely challenging to answer the most important questions, frankly, without letting something like bias slip in. And the more that you do focus on that end user, that empathy, that to me is the best antidote I think you can use.
Good. You can mark empathy as a thumbs up. I guess I want to circle around as something Eric had mentioned. It was that book, Elephant in the Brain, you know, which I have not read, by the way, but I love the title. I guess my next question is, how does human self-interest and even irrationality, which could be acting based on incomplete information, for example, that could be another form of it, how does that affect the approach and practice of behavioral design or behavioral science in terms of what the three of you do? I would think it'd be like core in many ways to a lot of the problems that you're asked to solve or deal with.
Could you repeat the question real quick? Sorry.
Yeah, I put it in the panelist feed. So how does human self-interest and even irrationality, you know, acting based on incomplete information, affect the approach and practice of behavioral design?
I think it probably gets to, sorry, what Eric was saying about just people asking the wrong questions because they are paid to. And so I think that that's constantly an issue of, you know, you're tasked to, you know, make this person's job more successful as, at least I am as a consultant, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person's job ought to be optimized or that they're solving the right thing. So sometimes it's required, which is a bummer.
I think another interesting aspect of that question too is that oftentimes behavioral design is focused on individual people's behaviors. So there's that piece of it, right? How are we kind of helping people to hopefully do good things that they want to do? But right, sometimes there is, we're recognizing that people don't always have their own best interests, let alone anyone else's. But Eric mentioned COVID, this pandemic earlier, and that to me is another really interesting example where our individual behaviors are important, but it's our collective behaviors that really matter, right? Like each one of us individually does or doesn't wear a mask. Hopefully we are, because it's science. That's a good thing. But it's really sort of within the collective. And that's an interesting place too. So that human self-interest, like how can we, there's been research that was done actually around the early days of COVID that asking people to wear masks because it was more helpful to other people was a better way to get people to do the right thing than just saying, well, it's good for you.
Right.
And part of that is the science, but part of it is also sort of recognizing how we impact other people's behaviors. And I'd argue, without getting into politics, here in the States, it is sort of an interesting situation where I think like that desire to sort of own my own agency can sometimes override that bigger picture. But we see that in things like sustainability as well, right? Where it's like individual behaviors that collect up to something much bigger.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, it's humans are endlessly fascinating. I'm sure about that. I want to go back to something we talked a little bit before about you're given a problem or somebody says, we'd like you to get involved with this, like this, people aren't reading the email enough, or like Eric talked about, or others. But in business, they have this thing called externalities, which are outside the problem or goal. They just treat them as externalities. Then there are adjacencies, things that sort of are around the problem, but not the problem themselves. So how, as behavioral scientists or designers, how do you determine what is core, adjacent, and external to the problem that you're probably reframing? I put that also in, I'm putting questions as I ask them into the feed. But
I think Ruth probably has some good thoughts on this based on some of her work. But I'll start. I think this is actually an area that is starting to be explored in behavioral science more. I would say, I think it's kind of a criticism of it sometimes, maybe more like traditional behavioral economics, which isn't that much different, but it's a little more bigger and influential. And that a lot of times I think it's true in a lot of cases where they say we're designing for this, we're trying to improve this action, help people take this action, improve this outcome. And sort of looking at that in a very isolated manner and not really considering all of the other downstream effects that could be caused by that change. One example I can think of is I think there was one study, so a really famous example in behavioral economics is using defaults for retirement contributions, where people traditionally retire 401ks, you have to opt yourself into the program. And despite people wanting to do it, they never get around to doing it. So they never invest in their 401k, they never save for retirement. And it's just a behavioral issue. So a really famous behavioral science, behavioral economics example is that they flipped that where you're automatically opted in into a standard fund and a standard contribution rate and that kind of thing. And lo and behold, people stay because they want to be in it anyway. They stay in it and they keep investing. They generally, even though they have the freedom to leave the program, they usually don't because that's what they want to do. But there was one study that looked and noticed that some people, they did save for retirement, but they also went into debt at times. And I don't remember the exact study if it was more often, but feasibly you could see okay, people want to save for retirement. They're happy they're saving for retirement, but they also haven't changed their spending habits at all. So that money that's going into retirement, hey, it's good, it's sitting there, but they're also spending the same amount and they're putting on their credit card. So I think that's sort of a next step of being explored. And I would consider it this gets into a little more what I would call complexity science or complex systems, where There's so many interactions and so many side effects of all these things. And I think generally behavioral science is focused on a little more isolated problems. And I'm starting to see more discussions. And I think Ruth is one person that's been looking at this, and I'm looking forward to her discussing it more. But I think this is sort of a next area, another field for that to go into, is thinking, how do we combine these behavioral interventions while considering all the implications that happen within a complex system with complex people and things like that.
Ruth or Rochelle, you want to jump in on that?
Well, since Eric teed me up, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in.
Go for it.
No, I would agree that, yeah, historically, I sort of said this too, I guess, it's been about like individual behavior change. There's increasing recognition, like I've been having more conversations on, yeah, how do we think about designing behavior into complex systems? Because that's the world we live in, right? Like COVID actually offers another interesting example where, you know, it's one thing to stay at home, but there's been research, for example, that shows that it's increased incidence of like domestic violence and like not behavior like we're talking about it, but like behavioral illness in terms of like mental illness and whatnot. So like being able to see what the implications of certain interventions are going to be is crazy important, because we can't just sort of say like, oh, solved that, let's go home, if it's going to then have ripple effects. And so there actually is some work that I've been doing with somebody named Caitlin Stenger, who's at UVA, on exactly this kind of stuff. Like we're calling it sort of like behavioral planning, if you will. So it's almost like taking a scenario planning approach to how do we sort of understand what contexts might be changing and how that weighs in, and how to actually, you can't obviously predict the future. Nobody would say that that's even a good idea necessarily. But how can we sort of start to see both complexity in terms of what other things are in the mix, so you can design recognizing that it's like a pinball effect, but also like what are likely things that may happen. So in the design world, we sometimes talk about the cone of sort of plausibility. So you have like probable and possible and plausible worlds, sort of taking a similar view where we're not declaring anything's going to happen, but at least we have a little bit of foresight that can help us to recognize that. So I think it's an exciting place, actually, where there's going to be hopefully some really interesting stuff going on that maybe is less scientific method driven, but can inform the hypothesis that we then work from.
Yeah, absolutely, right. I guess I'm going to open it up. We're going to do like a 90-degree turn, or maybe a 180. What most excites you in terms of where behavioral science and behavioral design is evolving, and the trends that you see in sort of the way it's going?
Well, I feel like I just showed my hand because I was like, I think, you know, what we've been talking about, maybe it's a little less 180 degree for me. I think that sense of how to build in sort of foresight and yeah, thinking in more of a systems and a complex systems way, I think is hugely exciting. And I do, like I said, there are more and more conversations about that. So I'm psyched about the direction that's going to go in. So I could talk about that all night, but I know that's not the only thing.
So what I am very excited about is that it seems as though at least for the behavioral science specific part of the world that I'm more familiar with, it's been around long enough now that we're really kind of seeing different models, you know, playing out within businesses, or even different operating models of how this should integrate. And it's cool to start seeing, oh, wow, like what will this become? Is this going to be like a new expectation that a lot of us kind of have some set of this knowledge? Is it going to be often contained within highly specialized teams? And just seeing like what works. And so, you know, we want to scale whatever is working. And then I think also in general, it feels like that there's more of a dialogue happening. We're starting to realize that some of the things that we are talking about are the same concepts using different words to maybe name or describe it. And even the move toward just being very thoughtful and research oriented is wonderful and refreshing. As someone who has worked for a lot of different businesses, very smart businesses full of very smart people, oftentimes, you know, decisions are not necessarily based on evidence. And when there is evidence, it might be more convenient, as we've talked about. So all of this shows me that we're turning toward something that is fruitful, and is worth it, because ultimately it's going to lead to a better experience for all of us as consumers, employees, citizens of these processes.
Eric, how about you?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. I'm gonna cheat a little bit and say two things. One, I think it's just like the scale of the opportunities out there. Like I mentioned, like the world is overly and unnecessarily complicated and hard to interact with, and there's just so many things that we can still do to improve that. I mean, I feel like if the government hired a massive agency of designers to just redesign every one of their services you interact with, that would be a massive welfare improvement. Like think about how many people rely on these things, but they're so hard to use, you know?
We can create a whole new federal agency, Eric, around that.
When I'm president next 2024, maybe, yeah. So there's just the scale of opportunities is really exciting. And, you know, I'd say the other thing is just like stuff like this is really exciting. I think, you know, people coming from different disciplines to learn about this kind of thing, even as someone who is more of a specialist in this, I think the future of this is not people like me who are sort of a subject matter expert. It's people in other roles learning enough about psychology, learning enough about behavioral science, applying these kind of methods and doing it in their own jobs. I think this will really be more powerful. And I feel like, you know, a lot of design methods is a similar thing. Is if this becomes more of a normal thing people do as part of their job and not just something that behavioral scientists do, that's what I think is really exciting. I think, you know, more people getting engaged and learning about this is kind of how we get there.
Cool. Yeah, I think it was Kuhn in his book on scientific revolutions in the 60s. He said the greatest innovations never happened within a field by experts. It happened from people coming outside the field into the field and seeing things in new ways, and you know, sort of becoming like a little bit of a bull in a china shop, and I think we've all seen that empirically. I want to jump on something. I think Rochelle mentioned about teams, about collaborative teams or working collaborative teams. You know, we live in a collaborative world now. You know, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, pan-disciplinary world where people work together to explore and reframe a problem. And I think Ruth talked about that in terms of like participatory design, working directly with users, for example. How do you navigate in your experience and your experiences, how do you navigate the complexities of team skills to integrate when behavioral design or science is applied within a team in terms of activities and deliverables? So how do you divide and conquer? How do you work in teams in order to integrate behavioral science? And what is your role and other people's roles who maybe aren't behavioral scientists or designers?
I can jump in a little bit on that. So even though I'm teaching at a school now, there's when I worked at Dublin, which is an innovation consultancy, now part of Deloitte, I was there for about 9 or 10 years, and I did exactly that. I used behavioral design as a designer in this big consulting firm. One way in which it was actually really good is that design can sometimes feel hand-wavy and like you're making things up. And what was really powerful actually about being able to say like, no, there's research that shows X, or we're suggesting something because we actually have some like experiments and experimental results that can give us some confidence about what we're doing. So in that regard, both for people that I was working with, but also for clients, I found using behavioral science was really powerful because it made people more comfortable that we could be de-risking something rather than just like making things up the way sometimes folks think design is, which it's not, but that's another topic for another night. So that was useful, but I can't remember if it was Eric or Rochelle who was talking about this earlier. The fact that we use the same words to mean different things, that can be a bit of a challenge, right? So if you're talking about research in design means one thing, research in behavioral science means something else. If you're doing work with, for example, a healthcare company, research means yet a third thing. So sometimes the clarity around like, what is it that we are doing and why is a certain methodology, like what is it trying to achieve? I think that can be important because we can sometimes misunderstand one another simply because we haven't been really explicit about what it is that we're doing and why this is, you know, what is it getting us? Like user research and design isn't necessarily going for the same kind of thing. that research in behavioral science is, because it's more about understanding the user context. Research in a lab is like obviously getting at different stuff. So I think the big picture there is like clarity of definition is super helpful and necessary.
Eric or Rochelle?
Totally agree with what Ruth said. I think that that is absolutely vital. And I think also that, you know, frankly, it's probably pretty hard to have a study that is as design led as it is behavioral science led at the exact same time. So if there is a collaboration, you know, I think it's possible that there's going to do one study well, one effort well, versus kind of forcing two mediocre halves together. I guess that's ultimately someone else's call, but I think it's about supporting and figuring out where you do interact. I do think that, you know, alignment is very key, talking about the end goal in as explicit terms as possible. What is the deliverable? What does it look like? What's the North Star? What's the so what? Who's going to use it? What is, you know, how do we know if it works? Everything you can do to make as explicit as possible what you're aiming for, of course. I mean, that's probably just regular advice, but it's particularly important in this avenue. And then I think also just figuring out who is your end user and ultimately what is it that they need, because there might not be as much sophistication in the method that they choose. You know, maybe you meet that there's a company that's kind of has like an anthropology type approach or like an ethnography method that they really rely on. That might not necessarily really feel like a different thing to the business person bringing this individual in, or to someone hiring ultimately onto a team. And so they might not necessarily know exactly what it is that you do differently. So I think just starting with your end user, who hopefully has also assessed what their end users need, is a great place to start.
Cool. Is there an evolving ethics in the practice of behavioral design or behavioral science? Probably behavioral science probably is more of a history of ethics, but I'm just wondering, what is the ethics in the practice of behavioral design or behavioral science?
Yeah, I can start on this one. It's hard to say like evolving, because I feel like ethics has always been, at least in the applied sense, pretty front and center. You know, I think most of the big researchers and authors who've kind of brought stuff to the mainstream, like they always were very, very clear that it's about, you know, helping people finish the job of stuff they're trying to do but can't do and stuff like that. So I think that's always been pretty front and center, but definitely what I think evolves is seeing, as we keep doing it more in practice, how complicated that can be. And what new issues arise, that it's not quite that simple all the time. I'd say like the biggest thing that I think we touched on this a little bit before, you know, I think those two big challenges are, do we really know what the person wants? You know, I think that's some criticism of some of the behavioral economics, especially stuff in the more government realm, and that like, are we assuming too much of what people actually want to do? I do think in general, the better ethical practice is not to like push people to do one thing, but to just equip them with making an easy decision one way or the other. But also like sometimes it is easier. I mean, if someone buys a like Fitbit or something like that, they clearly have a goal. Like they're buying that because they want to walk more, they want to move more, stuff like that. That's a pretty clear stated intention of what they're trying to do. So I think you can go ahead and do that, but it's not always that clear. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing, is like, how much are you nudging versus shoving versus just kind of like helping make the options very clear to understand. That's where we're going to be a little more complicated. And then the other thing, just looping back to what I said before, is also just this sort of like self-deception angle, and that we all have our own incentives of what is good for us and what makes our job successful. And it's very easy to convince ourselves that what we think is good, either what's good for us from a professional standpoint, or just what we think is good for people, is what they want. And we have to like really have good gut checks against that to question those assumptions and you know, validate those to make sure that we're actually empowering people to make better decisions, do what they want to do, and not just we think that they should do.
Rochelle or Ruth?
I think the ethics are a challenge, but I think that actually behavioral scientists, behavioral designers, we spend a lot more time thinking about it than a lot of other folks that reside in some of the organizations that we work with or are employed by or whatnot, or customers of. So I think there's something very interesting about how much pressure we place on our shoulders, whereas I think someone who is, fantastically talented marketer and has been doing it for their life, and they get great outcomes, and they are, they're not seeking to do wrong, but I don't know what level of pressure they put on themselves. And so I do think that there's, I guess, coming from this academic world, there is this culture, at least, and I agree that it should exist, but it is interesting to try to figure out what is appropriate. And there's also something weird about how it's almost, if you can measure it, is when it starts to get creepy and unethical. We're all choice architects. We all design things. We all accidentally nudge people around based on what we do. But somehow once we start applying this term science to it, it starts to feel a little shaky. And I don't have an answer, but I think it's really interesting to ponder.
And I can just maybe pile on a little bit too. When I teach behavioral design, and I think some of my past and present students are here, I always like to end on a conversation around ethics, because sort of to Rochelle's point, like it's whether it's in marketing, whether it's in pricing, like there are ways in which, if you know the ways in which people process information, you can totally use that knowledge for bad, and you can totally use it to manipulate. And as it's interesting, because I think the conversations around ethics have been happening a lot more in design, from my experience at least, than they did maybe, 10 years ago. So part of it is like, I think as designers, we do like to have those conversations. But the fact that you understand and can, again, it's not, behavioral design should not be about being manipulative, but it can slip into that, because the more that you know about how people behave, the more you can design things. Anyone who's played any sort of gamified, app or been addicted to things because like, I just can't put it down. Like there's an aspect of behavioral design to that we need to kind of be careful about, because it's too easy for that to slip in the interest of selling more stuff and all that kind of business. What is interesting, and this is an academic paper, so it may not be up everyone's alley, but there was a paper that got written pretty recently, within the past 6 months or so, where they actually start to lay out a framework. It's called For Good, like literally FORGOOD as an acronym, and basically like laying out some tenets for how to think about being an ethical designer. And I would say in my mind, there were certain things they left out, but it's actually pretty good as far as being sort of a good step towards like, let's actually codify what it looks like, and not just like, yeah, let's be honest. So it was I think a good contribution to that conversation.
Great, thank you very much, Ruth. I have one more question, then we're going to turn it over for just more general Q&A. What advice would you give someone aspiring to work at the intersection of social science, psychology, whatever the social sciences, and design, to become a behavioral scientist or designer? The people that might be on the call tonight, who this may be the first time they've heard of it, or who knows?
I think my answer would be to start doing it, because there are, if you own anything in your day-to-day, maybe you help run an organization, you're a student, but you participate in you're part of a group project, or something socially, something professionally, you publish the newsletter. If you have some channel by which to intervene and introduce, some kind of theory-informed or research-informed or human-centered design-informed change, I think that is a great opportunity for you. You don't have to ask permission. You can get started on it and then learn, figure out what you're getting out of that, have a conversation with someone who could maybe segue that into an additional opportunity. And yeah, I think there's opportunities everywhere, and it's not And really, I think the people that can do the most behavioral design, honestly, are people probably that do not have that in their title at all, any of those words.
Ruth or Eric?
Yeah, I would just building on that. I mean, part of it, there's some statistic which I'm going to completely botch, but it's something like 60% of jobs that people are going to have in 20 years don't exist yet. I think this is one of those fields where it's like, it's still a super new field. I don't know if people realize that as much. Like, it's not as though people haven't thought about decision-making before, but behavioral economics is really only like 40-ish years old. It kind of started in the mid 70s. And behavioral design is much, much newer than that. So I think part of it is, yeah, kind of getting steeped, like recognizing, learning from what's out there. I think there are definitely programs, right? You can get like PhDs in this. But I think, yeah, being exposed to how to look at that. In some cases, there still is, I think, that bar of having a degree. But if you look at other industries, similar things have happened where it sort of started in one place and then over time, it was about having the experience rather than an explicit degree that gets you places. So I think we're still kind of in that transition mode, but I would say like, soak it up, be curious, talking to lots of people. I'm loving that we're having this conversation tonight because we're all coming from different areas. Like we did not start in the same place and we're not going to end up in the same place, but we've all found ways to sort of work this into our professional lives. So that's going to continue to change, I think.
Yeah, piggyback.
Go for it, Eric.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback on both of those. I think two biggest things. I mean, best way is like be a student of people, and just always there's tons of behavioral science literature out there, tons of awesome books, but I mean, just observe and watch what people do. I mean, a lot of Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for documenting a lot of the basic behavioral science principles. I mean, he said at one point, he's like, all we did was like take what car salesmen already knew, and we documented them in like repeatable process, and that people, any type of job you're in or any type of role, you are interacting with people and you are trying to get people to do something in some kind of way. So a lot of the people that really identified a lot of this stuff before it was ever documented in academics were people that just were tinkering around and they just observed how people responded to things and tested different things and built up this kind of expertise. So yeah, just be a student behavior, learn a lot, observe people, read and learn a lot, and apply it to whatever you're working on. Like there's not one job in this world where it doesn't require you to try to persuade people in some kind of way or drive behavior. So there's always opportunities to do it, and you can start whenever you want.
That's right. Expose yourself and it's trial and error. Just a quick side note, I remember when I was an undergraduate and I read Ralph Kaplan's book, By Design. He was a writer on design in the 70s. He just passed away not too long ago. But he had a whole chapter called situational design. That's what he called it. He had no term for it. So he says, designers can design situations. And he used the civil rights movement as an example or Gandhi, how you create situations and how you can architect these situations to affect change. And so I think a lot of what you guys are talking about is trying to understand the request, trying to understand the context, then asking the right questions in order to determine what should be focused on in terms of understanding the existing behavior and what could be done to actually get it to a desired state and what behaviors can make that desired state happen. So it's a lot of intriguing things you guys presented. What I'd like to do is to turn this over to Krista and Leslie, because obviously I see the chat. I haven't read the whole chat, but I'm sure there's lots of things going on in the chat that they've been sort of monitoring. And then I'll circle back around near the end just to share some initial thoughts because I'm processing what you guys talked about. But I just want to thank you for being such good sports on the questions. And I'll turn it over to Leslie and Krista.
Thanks. Yeah, I've done my best, and thank you everyone who's submitted questions. We've been kind of watching them as we go. There was one that was submitted in the chat, which I think is really interesting. I think it was from Maho. Would any of you have examples of how you've seen, behavioral design applied in energy or sustainability or organizational transformation? So I think energy and sustainability in particular sounds super interesting to me. Organizational transformation as well. I'm sure lots of people are interested in that. So any thoughts on that? And I can put this into the chat as well.
Yeah, I could think a couple for energy and sustainability. I mean, a really famous example is O-Power, which is an energy company, and they created the like utility bills where it shows your energy usage and then it compares you to your neighbors in your neighborhood. And they tested this in like a formal experiment. And they found that like people who were above the normal threshold almost immediately reduced their energy usage to match like the average because they didn't want to be like, because it's one of those things, you know, behavioral science is all about context. We don't really have any context of what a normal amount to be paying or energy to be using is. So they provided that context, and some of those like social norms are like, oh, I'm using a lot more energy than other people. I shouldn't be doing that. And they adapt their behavior right away. And there's some other interesting study. I don't remember all the specifics, but they evaluated people's like, I think it was like consumers' interest in buying like electric cars, like sustainable products and stuff. And however they ran the experiment, they found that people were a lot more likely to purchase like sustainable products and electric vehicles when they were shopping in public or if they were being observed than if it was in private. And that there was a little bit of like a social pressure where they felt like, oh, I don't want people to know that I don't care about this in some kind of way, or that that's not my ideal. So I like both those examples because I think people do want to be sustainable, but they also have a lot of other competing incentives. They have tight budgets, they have all these kind of things. And that it's one of those examples where people don't always have to do something for the right reason necessarily. I mean, if sustainability, you know, like Teslas, for example, or electric vehicles, but they're very like cool and they're very like luxury, basically prestigious. So like people don't necessarily buy them because they're electric, that's a bonus, but they buy them because they have like a brand to it, you know. So those are two kind of interesting examples of like non-intuitive ways that people are kind of motivated to be more sustainable.
And I can maybe address the other part of it around the organizational behavior or organizational dynamics. There's a ton of interesting work recognizing, for example, that even just as basic as like hiring gets in there are biases that get in the way. So if people see, you know, a name that looks like basically white men on a resume have a higher chance of getting in. I think there was some like hilarious stat almost that according to certain algorithms, if your name was like Chad and you played lacrosse in college, you had a better chance of getting a job at certain places. I think it was maybe even at Google. Don't quote me on that. But there are ways in which, yeah, seeing certain attributes can bias us to think that somebody may be more or less likely to do well in that job, even if that's not the case. And I've actually been doing a lot of work in that space lately around sort of assessing research or assessing applications in order to get into organizations. So there's actually quite a bit at that stage. I think what's an interesting, I don't want to say gap because there's some work, but how do you keep that persistence, right? I think the issues of like inclusion and diversity and equity in terms of getting people into jobs, for example, is one part. And there are things like blind auditions, which people may be familiar with, for example, like ways to debias that process. I think the trickier thing in some ways is once people get into an organization, for example, how do you make sure that there's equitable opportunity? How do you make sure that, you know, behaviors are kind of helping to think through, or you're helping to think through behaviors that can keep people persistent and retained? Because we all know, for example, that like things like mentoring may not be as valued as things that are like very tangible and easily measurable. And if people succeed in an organization, they tend to think that their way of looking at it is like the way of doing things. And so you can get these vicious cycles about sort of who's considered smart or good or who moves up. So I think there's a lot of work done. And I saw somebody in the chat talking about organizational design at BetterUp. So I'm going to check that out actually. So there's a lot about getting in the door. I think there's a little bit less about what happens once you're there, which is I think an equally important need.
Great, thank you. All right, I found another one in the Q&A. different question. So how do we outsmart AI? Eric was talking about more humans getting better behavioral science background, but actually we need the machines to get ahead of the humans. How? I'm going to put this in the chat as well. Eric, perhaps you want to give it a go?
Directed at me, yeah. Let me read, make sure I'm like under smart AI. I don't think at this point we need to think about outsmarting AI. The way that I think about like AI, there's a really good, I cannot pronounce her last name, but there's Google has this like head of decision science, I think, who writes really, really cool stuff about decision making in organizations. When I'm done talking, I'll try to find a link and put her up. But she has really good frameworks to think about how like we have behavioral science, we have decision science, we have machine learning, and we have data science, we have all these things. How do these things work? And I think she had put it in a way that makes a lot of sense to me, and that like we're always making, the way this stuff is useful is like there's decision making. If we have perfect information, decisions are easy. If we don't have perfect information, then we have uncertainty. We're pretty much always making decisions with uncertainty. All of these different tools are basically ways to grapple with uncertainty. And stuff like machine learning and AI is really a way to automate decision making. So when there's something that we can repeat, that we can make a repeatable way to make that decision that's efficient and accurate, that we can reduce our, yes, Gary just put her name in there. Thank you. She's awesome. So I think it more is like a way of automating decision making and automating ways in a way that reduces kind of our cognitive load so we can work on other things. I'm not too worried about outsmarting AI yet. I don't think AI is that smart. And I'm also a little skeptical. I think like human decision making is so complex and hard to understand. I'm not sure we'll ever be able to actually engineer it. But to me, that's how I think in the grand scheme of these things, that's how I kind of think of machine learning and AI.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm really punching above my weight with every word that I say from here on out. But I think if we were to use more interpretable models, that also could be helpful, because I think we have these like kind of crazy like black box models that like are just excellent at optimizing an outcome no matter how it happens. And that can be driving some really vicious, side effect externality behaviors. And so, if we actually had a more interpretable model or like better guardrails on things, which I think it has to be coming, I think, just in terms of how powerful these, we volunteered all of our data to Mark Zuckerberg, and here we are. So like, we are reaping, some major consequences. But maybe that is one thing that companies could do to make more of a standard practice, harder to abuse.
And I can sort of come at this from maybe a slightly different slant also, because I'm always fascinated by the idea of like noise in data. I actually just wrote a piece for this a couple of months ago that we can throw in the chat or not. But one of the things that can fall out of AI also is sort of looking for signals, right? Like what are the things that are sort of telling us what to do? Because oftentimes what AI is really good at is like, it's programmed to drive us towards certain types of outcomes. And computers are great at executing commands. One of the things we do need to worry about when we're thinking about AI, and this ties back to the ethics conversation a bit, is that when you have a human being who is programming something or creating an algorithm, their biases become part of that algorithm. So if unchecked, what can happen is that whatever that person thinks is like, this is good, or this is right, or this is the data that makes sense, those biases can end up getting integrated into an algorithm, which can be super dangerous. People are probably aware of this, right? So like a lot of the examples that we are aware of in terms of high tech are because it just sort of pumps things out without having a check on like, oh, by the way, you threw out really important data, or maybe you didn't have data to start with that was going to inform more equitable solutions. So I think it actually requires, sort of oversight is maybe the wrong word, but kind of thinking throughout the entire process. What are we trying to solve for? Who's designing the algorithms? What data is available or not? It's kind of a multi-stage thing. And yeah, I would agree. It's less about maybe outsmarting AI, and it's just being super duper smart about how is it that we are creating AI so that we don't kind of let it run amok. There's a great book, if folks haven't read, called Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, which sort of talks about what happens when you don't do that. It's great, also sad, but a lot of really good case studies in there that's worth looking at.
Great, thank you. So another question we have, I'm just going to read it. I feel that the socialization of behavioral economics and intervention design has grown and people tend to understand the basics, but there's a massive opportunity to educate the everyday person about how to apply it in quality ways. So the core question there is, how do we democratize it in ways that are productive and quality driven?
I hate to be a cynical jerk, but this will happen when we all get like lessons on personal finance. And, I just feel like that this is an amazing skill, but I don't know exactly the way it gets democratized, because it just feels like there's a lot of those in the world and we're not getting any of them. But I may be just jaded by this year. Who has a productive idea?
I mean, I think that's definitely a good point. I think the personal finance example is a really good one. Like, I worked in sort of behavioral finance for a little while, and everyone's always like, oh, if only we taught people in high school personal finance. And it's like, there's this zero, I mean, there are tons of research on this. It just like the education does not correlate to behavior, right?
Right.
I do like, I also am sort of passionate about this in some ways. So I think there's sort of two ways of looking at it, and that we should always assume that people are too busy and too stressed to actually learn a new thing to like apply to their life. So we should think about, again, I think the bigger opportunity is how do we make this a part of those of us that are designing the things that people are interacting with every day? How do we just make it easy? Like, I think that gets a lot of the way. If we just design better systems that are for people that are easier, that's the biggest way it spreads around. But I mean, for people that want to learn these skill sets, yeah, I think, there was a really good article, and I'd have to maybe Google it, maybe I can put the chat. There was a good article in Behavioral Scientist recently about this, and like basically empowering people to use behavioral science and design on their own. There's some kind of books out there like that, but there's probably not a good practical guide. I'll try to Google it when I get done talking here and put in there. But I do think it is really powerful, and I feel like it helps in a personal level to sort of like understand. I mean, I got into it in the first place just because there were so many things that I repeatedly was not doing, and I was so confused by it. And I'm like, what is wrong with me? And it's powerful in the sense that I think it helps you understand a little bit of your failings more, and that they're not really failings, they're just like being normal human beings. I also think it helps you see the world in a better way, and that, number one, you're more empathetic. I have a hard time judging people for failing at something, because every single one of us have something that we are failing to do that we want to do. So not really on me to call anyone else lazy when there's certain things that I'm not doing. And I think just like some of the confusing things about the world make more sense. We understand how people make decisions. So yeah, I think that's definitely an opportunity to make easier toolkits where people, they don't want to do this at work. They just want to understand, here's the basics, here's how I apply it in my day-to-day life, here's what I need to understand, and go from there.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just one more thing to sort of build on that. Two, there can be, we talked a little bit earlier about, this learning curve that, you may feel like, oh, I know nothing. If you're just getting into the field, there's this big hill to climb. There's also kind of how to think about using these concepts in a professional setting. There's a lot that can be learned just sort of in that in between. And there's this notion of system one and system two thinking that Daniel Kahneman introduced, for example, where system one is being reflexive and just sort of like responding to things. And it can sometimes seem like we're supposed to be making ourselves into what he calls system two, which are these like really, really sort of very, very good decision makers. I always feel like that's unfair to us also. So recognizing where we are, it's sort of building on some of what they're saying too, like we're flawed, recognizing that we need to sort of, how do we make ourselves better? But it's not about necessarily becoming perfect or becoming, you know, excellent decision makers in every situation. I think it's the same sort of empathy that we show users, we need to show ourselves, I guess. And yeah, the article that I just saw Eric posted too, that's it. So it's an exciting way to think about what, yeah, how to integrate some of this thinking and not have it be just sort of more of day to day. It doesn't necessarily have to be this sort of specialized field for everyone all the time.
I think Eric mentioned this as like a bit of a, like facetiously, but I mean, maybe one use case just to get really out of the box, since I don't want to just seem like a pessimist, is if you have bought a car, you know what this, you know this field. And if you kind of reverse all the things that really bummed you out about that experience, that actually does provide some like interesting fodder to play with. So maybe we can do a public campaign to make people realize they actually already know more about this than they realize, or something like that.
I'll actually have like one more just to piggyback on what Ruth and I touched on a little bit, like this kind of empathy angle. I think we're at a time where that's at the peak where we should be a little more empathetic about people, and that we're in a difficult situation. None of us have normal lives right now. And there's a lot of like judgment of other people's decisions in this environment. But the problem is like all of us are dealing with things in different ways, and we all have to make hard choices a lot of the time. And we all are generally being given very poor choices to make that are not really ideal in any sense of the way. So I think it's kind of a good, this whole pandemic's a good example of like, everyone's trying to make do with the best that they can. Everyone kind of is hearing different things and not totally sure what's right or wrong. And that it's a good time to understand that like we're all interpreting things different ways, we're all struggling in different ways, and that you know, we need to cut each other a little bit of slack in some of these things.
Like it. So I'm seeing a question from one of our alum. Hi, Jack. Nice to see you on the call. He asked if you all, if Ruth or others could touch on some participatory design research methods. So this would be more for our practitioners on the call.
Well, I can jump in. Hey, Jack. Yeah, so I can maybe tell like a specific story. That may be a useful way to talk about it. So this is actually work that I did when I was at in practice at Dublin. We were working with the VA hospital, so Veterans Hospital, and helping the vets, helping them to think about how to get vets sort of to get to appointments and to even recognize when they needed to get medical help. So there was a lot of behavior in this, right? It was sort of, in some ways, more kind of discrete behavioral change, like getting people to appointments, making appointments, having them show up, that kind of deal. One thing that we found really useful in that case was sort of thinking in terms, I'm not always a fan of journey maps, but it was a really useful artifact in this case, where we were able to first kind of like play out, okay, what are the ways, what are all the sort of very, very end-to-end opportunities that we may have? And then using an artifact like that to then build off, like understanding, for example, where were barriers coming up? So it was an opportunity to start with a little bit of a structure. So we weren't just going in and it wasn't just pure research, but it was an opportunity to kind of build off of experiences that folks had, that they went through, and then be able to very directly kind of get very quick feedback. I think that was one of the other things that was useful. It was not only participatory, but it was also an opportunity to kind of test and prototype in a really kind of quick cycle way. How to see like where some of our misunderstandings may play out, and also thinking about how to, yeah, kind of elicit from folks like what was actually in, you know, if we may think, oh, people just didn't want to show up for something, and it turned out, no, actually it's about public transportation, or they didn't have a way of getting there. Like that kind of stuff was super useful to kind of learn on the ground, and then be able to think about, well, what are some ways to start to address that? So I found, I guess, the two sort of high level things out of that are participatory design using structures is often really useful, because it means that we can still maintain some of the kind of thinking and planning and coming in with ways of sort of having a not a baseline for a solution, but something to talk around was super useful. So that hopefully is kind of useful just in terms of like a specific example rather than generalities.
Yeah. I don't think I have any experience, honestly.
Yeah, no. Eric, did you have any builds or good there?
Yeah, that's a little more outside of expertise, so that covered it.
Perfect. So shifting completely, we had a question about kind of related, like how might you get into this field? So we had a question around neuroscience or behavioral science. What should you study? Obviously, you know, would be curious to hear beyond that too, if you think you need, you know, a degree in it. There was a question about like how important might a PhD in this field be, specifically when you're working with creatives versus academics. So thoughts on kind of what to study and the importance of that in this field. I'm sure it depends. Who wants to take a stab at that?
It's all you, Eric.
Maybe talking about your own experience. That could be helpful and people around you.
Let's see, so the question, it's behavioral science or neuroscience? Let me just make sure technically, I'm not sure if this is accurate. Technically, neuroscience might be a part of behavioral science more broadly, because behavioral science, but again, like I mentioned, these terms get thrown out in a lot of different ways. Behavioral science, I think the way we talk about it is probably more behavioral economics, I guess. Good question. I mean, I would say behavioral science, neuroscience is useful, but that's kind of a very specific part of decision making. And I think it's more interesting to look at all the ways that we actually made decisions than into like the chemistry of what happened when they made those decisions. I think that's more impactful and useful, although a certain level of neuroscience is definitely helpful. But that's kind of what I would say. I would also say I definitely am not an expert in neuroscience by any means. But I feel like I feel like neuroscience would be more interesting understanding the basics of decision making and behavioral science before that, so you can sort of connect those dots a little more.
Mm-hmm. I think if you like want to get pumped about things on like a cellular level and like how dopamine makes you do different things, and that neuroscience is great. And then if you want to like have a reason to learn loosely about that and then also do a lot of other things, I think that probably turns you more toward the behavioral science route. And then as far as the whole like what do I study, I would just, I mean, who has a job you like? And, you know, what did they do? How'd they get there? Because I think I mean, I'm sure that, you know, PhDs in neuroscience are like wildly qualified and great for a whole class of jobs that they are like never employed in because it just hasn't happened before. And there's no groove, there's no like pathway there. So I think that would be a place to start. But I also think, you know, PhDs are, you know, when you're in an academic world, absolutely does seem to matter more. I have an undergraduate degree and I've been a practitioner. I apply this stuff. I kind of try to hang out with the academics, but for the most part, you know, my value comes from the fact that I can speak the language that a lot of the clients that I work with use, and they are also business folk. So yeah. Just figure out what you want to do and what the people that are doing did to get there.
Great. I like it. All right. So kind of similar. So, or on the same topic. In the consulting process, what are the current dynamics between cognitive neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and design? And on that note, which domain holds the most weight in decision-making and influence? Where are there more opportunities for more positive contribution? So I'm going to put this in the chat here. I know it's a long one.
I can take a little bit of a stab at that, although I'm less, I don't have any neuroscience background whatsoever. But in consulting, like I was a consultant in a design and innovation group. which maybe has its own particular slant. I don't know if it's about necessarily which holds the most weight. I think what's really useful is actually knowing enough of sort of being a good translator. Maybe that's one way to say it. That you can say that certainly, behavioral psychology is great for understanding decision making and influence. You could argue that design research has its own flavor to that. And like I said, in areas that I don't really know, but presumably cognitive neuroscience also supplies quite a lot of thinking. I think though, no matter what it is that you go into, one of the most important things is serving that translation role between both you and your teammates, but also you and, people who are above you, for example, on the, up the ladder, as well as with clients. So I think behavioral science or behavioral psychology tends to be the most associated with decision making, so that certainly can't go wrong. But in terms of sort of using that to present a case or in a defensible way, I think part of it is just being able to kind of combine all those things. You can talk about decision making, but also being able to tell the user's story in which it's important, which is another really important consulting skill that may be coming more from the design side of things. So yeah, serving as that intermediary may be a way of thinking about it rather than sort of one being the best. I don't know if other folks have similar situations or experience with that.
Yeah, I think the intermediary is a good way to put it. It really depends when you say consulting process. I mean, that can mean so many different things in different types of engagements. I mean, the type of consulting that I do, it's usually mostly me just working with teams directly. So there's not like a neuroscientist there and stuff like that. So it's hard for me to say what those dynamics are. But I think if you are in a situation like that, like I would agree, it's kind of an intermediary sort of thing. And there's also different realms where some of these are neuroscience, for example. I feel like where I've seen it in industry, it's really more in like market research where people are like literally doing studies to measure how people from a neuroscience perspective react to reading something, viewing something. And that's a very specific action that's pretty separate from actually applying and building something into a product and stuff. That's input you might use in your building hypotheses, but it's sort of a very separate thing. So yeah, I would kind of agree with that.
Great. And I want to be cognizant of time here. I'm thinking we can do maybe one or two more and then wrap it up. I think we kind of touched on this earlier, but I think examples are, and just, hearing your thoughts on this is interesting. So someone had asked what apps or technology, or what are the apps or technology that you believe are doing a great job of walking the line of nudging behavior versus guilting or pissing off the user. So examples on technology or organizations you think are doing a good job with that line. And I will put this in the chat now.
I'm literally looking at the apps on my phone and thinking
No.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I see Gary's note on Duolingo. That got me until I didn't continue my streak, and then I annexed it from my life. So I don't know about that. Google is doing some cool nudges with their Gmail. You responded 3 days ago. Do you want to respond now, or like prompting you with like the easy responses? I mean, I personally find that kind. I don't think it has to necessarily be driving a economic value, but just to, and that also can be betrayed, but to show that there is trust there and that this company is kind of looking out for you. I've seen some other apps or recently that remind you if you are about to have a renewal, so you can decide if you want to do that or not, which is like wonderful. Such a smart way of creating trust in an underutilized channel.
Yeah, those are good ones. Yeah, I'm sort of blanking on like a really good example right now. I'm just thinking apps that I like using. I mean, I think generally like Spotify is something that I feel like they're doing a good job in improving the product and adding really good features that I like, but also not being annoying and not like it seems like they generally improve things in a way I want it to be improved, which is good. But yeah, it's hard for me to think. I feel bad. I probably shouldn't be blanking, but if we talk for a couple hours, maybe my brain's fried a little bit.
One of the interesting things, though, I think maybe, because I would agree with things, actually, Duolingo, yes, there are a couple here that I would agree, but oftentimes the mark of really good design is not that it screams at you like this is really great design, it's just that it sort of works its way into your life in an effective way. That you feel like, oh, this is helping me, and this isn't trying to make me addicted to something. So one of the things that some of the good examples may show is like, oh, Duolingo is helping me to learn that cool language. And I'm not necessarily thinking about the behavioral stuff that's baked into it. Whereas the things that are really annoying or frustrating are probably because they're hitting that with a really heavy hammer, or because it's sort of very clearly trying to manipulate us. So it's probably easier to come up with bad examples in a weird way than good ones, because the good ones tend to be like, oh, this is just so much easier than I ever expected. So I don't know, that's often true of just like design in general. So it might apply here as well.
Just one last question.
Actually, from that latest, like that is maybe that was a good framing where I think of like apps that just made things easy. Like I've used like MyFitnessPal a lot to just track like food and stuff. And that made it like a second nature habit, like Personal Capital for tracking finances. It's like things like that I don't even think of as behavioral, but they've just helped me make things a regular part of my life that I kind of already wanted to do. So.
And there was one last question very much related to what we're talking about now that I thought might be a good one to wrap it up. Could each of you share a favorite example of how behavioral science has been used either by a researcher or an organization in the past year?
Past year.
Yeah.
Twist,
yes.
It's not being used well, but I do appreciate all of the, I love that we've had to deal with bell curves this year. Like it means if we actually understood statistics and like this uncertain world we live in, and this was such an interesting chance for us to like try to get our heads around a really, important concept of just living in this uncertain world that we can't know what is coming for us. And obviously could have done a better job, can still be doing a better job, but I think that it's fun to see like the epidemiologists having a time in the spotlight. They deserve that. They deserve much more than that, but that's it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. With so much, especially in the last year, I think it's trying to think of examples of there's so much information out there and so much complex information. And a lot of these bigger issues don't really have explanations or answers. And, a lot of people talk about like, oh, like scientists don't know what they're talking about now. It's like, why are they always changing what they're talking about? And you're just watching science unfold in real time because that's how it is. It's very messy, and science is not definitive answers. It's a process of tearing down ideas and finding out what works. So I think like some examples, people that have really helped information. I've been, tracking a lot of the pandemic stuff. Like there's a reporter here in Illinois, Hannah Meisel is her name. She does like daily COVID updates for Illinois. And I like how, so mention like statistics, like a lot of the updates you give 3 data points, but there's so many other data points. And what I like is she gives updates with like 10 different data points that really tell you there's no framing there. It's like the entire story. It's like confirmed cases, like total cases so far, 7-day average, like recovered, and stuff like that. So I think like stuff like that's good, where it's like there's literally no room for misinterpretation. Like this is every piece of information that you have. And there's been some like really good modelers that have like modeled data well, some really good journalists. I think The Atlantic has really, really good journalists that have done like awesome work interpreting all these complex things and make them understandable. So yeah, that's a lot of what stands out, is just helping this crazy year be a little more hard, a little bit easier to understand.
I guess, when I'm trying to think about that, it's so hard to get out of the the crazy this past year has been. So to some degree, yeah, sort of understanding behaviors. I'm even just thinking like in the early days of COVID, right? Like even simple things like washing your hands for 20 seconds by singing happy birthday. There's some, as much as I do love the idea that behavioral science can work in these really, really big ways too. And I think that's where hopefully the future is going. I think there's a lot of potential there. I think in some ways, like where it can succeed and sort of be really useful is also in getting us over those smaller humps. Like, how do we know to wash our hands for long enough? Sing happy birthday, nice, direct, we all know it. It's interesting because with everything going on with COVID, like behavioral science kind of got trotted out initially, I think, as like behaviors, it's all about behaviors, you guys can solve it. And then there was a little bit of pushback almost when it turns out, surprise, behavioral science can't solve for everything because this is a much bigger problem than that. But I actually think in that case, like some of the sort of the smaller things that can just help us to get over smaller humps can actually be quite powerful. And I think sometimes there can sort of lost in that can be this sense of like, well, we need to solve for everything all the time. And that never really was the intention of behavioral science. It's always supposed to be working with other stuff. So I guess one reason it's hard for me to sort of answer the question to some degree is because I always feel like behavioral science connected with other types of solutions is maybe where the answer is at.
I'll actually add one more answer that I just thought of. I got a puppy this year, and it's probably been the best behavioral intervention I could have had because it makes me go outside more often than I used to go. It makes me walk and move around. It has no idea what's going on in the world, and it's just happy to be here, happy to eat food. And I mean, that makes it, stuff like that makes a big difference. And you don't have to get a puppy, but there's other things that can, simple things like just journaling, getting outside, getting some sunlight, exercising. I feel like a lot of those like simple basics and products that help us do that type of stuff more are really what's been really impactful for me, and I think for a lot of people this year.
Well, and super quickly building on that, like Pokemon Go was great for that, right? That got people out. I have no idea if there were behavioral scientists on those projects, but suddenly people were out, they were like outdoors twice, 3 times as much as ever before because there was a reason to do it. Yeah, and then there's a note in the chat about, yeah, some Japanese projects are very keen on that as well. So yeah, sometimes it's almost accidental. I don't know, you got to wonder.
Thank you. And I want to be cognizant of time here. There's so many additional questions we didn't get to. And I would encourage everyone on here, connect with all of us, LinkedIn, email, we're all around, and I think would love to continue this conversation. But Adam, I'm going to pass it back over to you to kind of wrap it up for the evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I want to thank Eric, Rochelle, and Ruth for such a wide-ranging discussion on this very, very large topic of behavioral science and behavioral design. I mean, I learned a lot tonight, obviously, by asking and also doing a lot of listening. I think there are like 4 key things that I sort of heard, and this is obviously just my perspective. One is behavioral science and behavioral design is about de-risking choice. That's something that was talked about a few times tonight. It's also about understanding and identifying the environmental levers that drive the way we act the way we do. Another one is exploring assumptions, biases, and getting alignment on teams, especially when dealing with problems. That insights can be good, but they also have unintended consequences. I think Ruth talked a little bit about that. And then the other one is really about how much opportunity there is in terms of applying behavioral science and behavioral design. The one thing that I thought about de-risking choice is it's about understanding choice and de-risking to help people do what they currently can't do. That's something that I sort of heard by different responses tonight. That behavioral design is tricky. That all the panelists tonight said they're not interested in changing the fundamentals of a person or actively designing their behaviors, but really to identify the conditions for desired behaviors. That's something I heard early on. Rochelle said something important that encapsulated to me what behavioral science and design might be about, is that we're all choice architects. I don't know where that term came from, but when I heard you say that, Rochelle, I thought, yeah, we're all choice architects, essentially. So put another way, how do we make people more successful in what they want to do or achieve by understanding their mental models and how to shape them? So it's about helping people to do what they currently can't do right now. And then using behavioral science and behavioral design, they're powerful because it's about being a good translator. We're talking about being a good translator and de-risking something. You know, how do we reduce exposure, unwanted exposure, to get to a better result? The environmental levers, Eric talked about that traditional focus of behavioral science, and Eric, I hope I didn't mangle what you said, was really about efficiency, which is cut through the biases, reducing risk, you know, testing in a smart way, and then finally getting to some type of impact, some sort of huge differentiator. So the value of behavioral science and design is really to address a world that's not very well designed. Eric talked about that several times, and that many problems stem from really a poorly designed world, a mediocre world. So how can we create a better world? In terms of exploring assumptions and biases and alignment, you know, how do you counter biases? Well, simply by asking questions, you know, questions of yourself and questions of people that you interact with. This can lead to solving a problem, you know, that nobody even asked to be solved. So in design thinking, that's called reframing a problem, or problem reframing. In collaborating with others, behavioral designers and scientists can help get teams aligned on an end goal in explicit terms as a North Star. So Rochelle, you talked about how do we define a North Star and try to get people focused on something, you know, that'll make a difference. There were several comments on participatory design to bring people in and bake their participation in by understanding their current behavior. But the challenge is understanding that, that decisions are not always based on evidence. I think that there's a lot of emotional issues that go into decision-making. And Eric, Rochelle, and Ruth's job is not to push people. They talked about that. Their job is not to push people, but equip people to make a decision. So it's about nudging versus shoving people into making decisions, which I thought was very, very important. That insights are great because they can be applied across business functions in the context of drive change. You can take insights and put them into a setting. I think we've talked about that. That setting is identifying change within a specific system. But the problem is complex systems have so many interactions and side effects that we may not be able to fully understand what those are at the time. For example, the age of pandemics or other types of things that were currently, you know, huge transformations. So seeing and understanding the implications of interventions are important. And then last is opportunity. And Eric talked about this, that the scale of opportunities are so incredible right now because the world is so complicated and hard to interact with. I think that's a huge takeaway. That's something that we understand intuitively, but we sort of just put aside. I also like on the other end, Ruth said that we can work on small problems and solve them in an insightful way to get over the small humps. I think that's really important. We don't have to boil the ocean and solve nuclear proliferation. We can actually work on, like, how come people aren't washing their hands? You know, which is something that is a huge problem, for example. And then lastly, I think Rochelle said it, that if you own things in a day-to-day way, and you have a way to intervene and introduce behavioral design or behavioral science, use that as an opportunity. And then, you know, so do it and then learn from it. So wonderful series of thoughts and comments. So I just want to thank you for such a great evening. Now, I think I'll turn it back over to Krista and Leslie.
No, I think that's it. I just want to say thank you all for joining. And there's been some really great conversation happening in chat and ways to connect with all the panelists. I really appreciate everyone's time. And we will be sharing the recording tomorrow. So if you want to revisit any of this, watch for that soon. Thank you all.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
For having us. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bye-bye.